This morning, today, now and in the worship service, I want to talk about child discipline. Now, I want to talk about this not because I'm an expert on the subject, but because I think it's a subject that concerns almost all of us, almost all the time, and is a cause of a considerable distress to most of us much of the time. My observations do not grow out of any great expertise in this area of rearing children, nor do they grow out of some great and remarkable successes that somebody's going to write up about or make a movie out of. Mainly, what I know about this grows out of my own worries and failures and conflicts. On the other hand, I think that I have learned some things that have helped me, and all I can do is share them with you and hope that they will help you as well. I can't come before you with somebody who has all the answers to how you should deal with your children, or even how I should deal with mine. But I come before you as somebody who wrestles with the problems just as much as anybody, and I can get very depressed about it, as well as be very happy about it. The Bible tells us that children are a blessing from God, and they're supposed to be a joy, and that's very true. Children are also a pain a great deal of the time. And there's no point in pretending otherwise. Man was made out of the ground, according to Genesis 2. That means that the ground is the source of life, and in the Bible there are many times where the Garden of Eden is compared to a woman, and vice versa. A woman in the book of Song of Songs is compared to a garden, and out of that garden come children. But the ground is cursed. Thorns and thistles it will grow for you. And although that does refer to the thorns and thistles that we see in the ground, it has a primary reference to humanity. It's human beings who are going to be thorns and thistles instead of trees. Psalms talks about the righteous man as a tree. But the Judges chapter 9 talks about the unrighteous man as a thorn bush and as a bramble bush. And so right away, immediately, the first child that's ever born in the world, Cain, is no tree but a thorn. And he causes grief and distress to his parents. Children are thorns. And thorns cause sorrow to the woman and to the man. I have heard men and fathers sometimes talk about how much they love to have kids. It's such a joy to have lots and lots of children. And it's just no problem. And anybody who thinks it's a problem doesn't know what's going on. I can tell when a man says that he's not terribly involved in the day-to-day of rearing his children. That mythology would be eliminated, that bubble would be burst rapidly if the man was involved with the children the same way the mother is. It is not an easy task, and sometimes it's not a very gratifying task to rear children. But the promise of the covenant and of redemption is that God will turn these pains and sorrows into joy if we are faithful. And the Bible everywhere encourages us to be faithful and to look to God to make up for our deficiencies and to overcome the natural sinfulness of our children. Thorns can grow into trees in redemption. Now, I have run in, as a Christian parent trying to do what's right, I've run into two problems, and maybe you run into these problems too. The first problem is the Bible does not seem to have a whole lot of immediate practical advice on how to deal with young children. It talks about how to deal with teenagers. It talks about how to deal with older children. It talks about talking to your child. And when your child is 2 and 3 years old, how do you deal with them? The Bible doesn't seem to have a lot to say about how to deal with young children. Now, we know we're supposed to spend time with our children. The Bible talks about when you walk by the way and when you lie down in your house, when you sit in your house. And we know that we're supposed to use the rod. But a lot of immediate practical questions don't get answered. So we go into a Christian bookstore and we buy books on how to be a good parent, books by Dobson and others. And I remember when my children were 2 and 3 and I was tearing my hair out, I went and got these books and they talked about how to deal with children that were 7 and 8, 9, and 10 years old. The things that they said to do didn't have a lot of immediate practical value with little kids. There's just not a whole lot of advice on that in print. But the second problem that I ran into was that the Christian church is full of people who are full of advice and who take real offense if you don't take their advice. Something that's worked for them, if you don't take it and try it with your kids, or if it doesn't work for your kids, then you get criticized. I've heard so much contradictory advice over the last 8 years that I could write a book on the subject, but I have better things to write books on. God giving me strength. But you have too. Now I want to ramble around in this hour and in the next with some things that have been helpful to me. And I've gotten them from a lot of places. Some of them I got from Ray Sutton. I remember when I moved here, Ray told me that an insight that had helped him a lot was to realize that God treats His people as children, particularly in the Old Testament. And if we look at how God deals with His children in the Bible, we get insights into how we can deal with our children. Not specific things, but general patterns that we can apply. And I found that to be very helpful. And it caused me to relax a little bit about some things that had concerned me. And so now I'd like to talk about some things that have helped me, and I hope that you can get some help from them as well. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the promise, the principle of promises, God's promise. We're going to talk about the two-witness principle, and we're going to talk about the diversity of the human race. And in the next hour, we're going to talk specifically about how God deals with His children in the Old Testament and draw principles from that. The first thing that we need to realize as parents as we confront the tribulation of dealing with our children as it sometimes comes across, now maybe your children are on good behavior these last couple of months, but if they're not, then maybe you understand what I mean by the tribulation of dealing with them. And you can think back to 2 or 3 months ago when your children were not on good behavior, and it was tribulation. The promise of the Bible is that God will bless us because Christ is faithful, not because we are. God has baptized your child and mine. We didn't do it. I, as one of the pastors here, might have been the one to sprinkle water on your child. I wasn't. I've never baptized anybody in this church, being a brand new elder. But one of the other elders probably did, or your child was baptized somewhere else. But it wasn't the man who did it, it was the office. The baptism was done by the caller, not by the man. Remember a fundamental distinction. It was Christ who baptized your child. And Christ has made a promise to the child, and Christ has put a claim on the child, and the promise is that in spite of all your mistakes and my mistakes, your unfaithfulness and my unfaithfulness, that God will bless the child. The promise is for the child. And this should make us confident and not fearful. It means, in a sense, God promises to make up for our deficiencies. And if we didn't have this promise, I think we'd be too fearful to do anything. What do you do with a 1-year-old child? How do you deal with it? Well, you can get locked up and not know what to do. But God promises to make up for our deficiencies, because we do make mistakes all the time, and that's true in all of life. You and I are always making mistakes and blowing it. But God promises that if we are generally faithful to Him, He will make up for our deficiencies. And even though this child is not being dealt with perfectly by me and you, God promises that since he is His child, He will take care of him. That's the promise, and I think that when we get really distressed about our kids, we should think about the promise, because it's true in spite of everything else. And it is the comfort that undergirds us and underlies us and helps us. Otherwise, we couldn't do anything with our children. We'd be too scared to. God promises to make up for our mistakes. So having started there, let's talk about the biblical principle of two witnesses. You'll notice that children have two parents. And that is the way God made the world, and that is an image of the fact that He is triune. He is 3 in 1, and He has made the human race in many different ways to image out the fact that God is 3 in 1. And in the family, one of the ways that God images His 3 in 1-ness is that He gives two parents and two witnesses. Now, two witnesses are not identical. The principle of having two witnesses is not to have a clone of the first witness, but to have an independent, separate, corroborative witness. you have a law court or any other situation. 2 different witnesses. And extending that biblical principle of the testimony of 2 witnesses into the family, we realize that father and mother are not the same, and they don't bear witness to the children in the same way. Now that's really important, men, because if you're like me, you want your wife to be just like you are. The tendency is to want to make father and mother identical. And all the literature on this says the father and the mother should always stand together before the child and always make the same witness. And that's true. But what is hidden in there and doesn't usually get discussed is that women don't manifest that witness to children the same way men do. And the tendency is to want to make the woman behave with the child the same way that the father does. This is especially true in the area of discipline, which tends to be what we do with our children a whole lot. In my marriage, we never fought till we had kids. Some of you are smiling. We begin to fight over how you deal with the kids. And that's part, I don't mean we fought all the time, but we had disagreements. All right? Now, I'm not taking my collar off here, see. Fathers tend to be more distant and more authoritative and more commanding with children. And that is one of the ways God deals with us. God deals with us by standing over against us and saying, do this. And that's the way fathers tend to deal with children. They say, do this. To stand over against a child, to be authoritative, to command. And this is good in teaching children to respond to authority. Men who are raised almost exclusively by their mothers and the father is never there in the home will have problem responding to authority in later years, usually. Unless now God is faithful in the covenant and He will make up the difference. But the tendency is still there and we need to be aware of it. The father is the one who tends to be authoritative and commanding with the children. The mother, on the other hand, tends to get right down in there with the child. Women tend to be good at communication, and they tend to be fairly bad when it comes to power struggles. Let's talk about the good and bad sides of this. It's good for the child to learn to respond to authority when the father issues commands. And it's good for the child for the mother to be right in there saying, now come on honey, let's do this. Women tend to coax a child more. But each of these things can go into a bad extreme. The father can be very arbitrary and lack gentleness in his dealing with children. I have known of homes where the home is more or less run like a military boot camp by the dad. I don't think that's very wise. I wouldn't say that every father has to be just like me, heaven forbid. But I think that one can go to an extreme of turning everything in the home into a command and response to a command. Now, on the other hand, for women, and you will find this to be true, and you'll find it in the books too, the problem with the woman is when she gets down and is right down there with the child, she can tend to get into a power struggle with the child and get into arguments with the children. You don't see fathers arguing with children. You do see mothers arguing with children. The difference is mothers tend to get down there where the children are and communicate with them, and that's good, and sometimes child needs to be argued with. So fathers, don't always condemn your wife when she argues with the child. The father tends not to do that, stands over against the child. Now this is the difference between men and women. It doesn't go away for pretending and trying to make it go away. You don't accomplish anything by trying to make father and mother identical in the way they deal with children. It'd be better for fathers to be fathers and mothers to be mothers. Now, of course, there's plenty of overlap. A father can take a child into his lap and rock him to sleep. A mother can issue commands in the household and whip the child when he disobeys. But the basic tendency is for the mother to get down there and communicate with the child. And the basic tendency is for the father to stand over against and give commands to the child. And those are perfectly legitimate differences. But conflicts come into marriage when we don't understand this and we think each of us have to be exactly the same. Ideally, children need both witnesses in the sense that both father and mother are communicating the same truths and the same lifestyle, but with a different manner. There's usually some tension. Fathers want the kids to be spanked more thoroughly. The mother thinks the father is being too harsh. It's easy to make mistakes on both sides. But the promise is that in spite of all the give and take and all the mistakes that we all make, God will make it good. So, remember this, and I think it's been helpful for me to cause me to relax and not be so uptight, that God does set up two different ways of communicating to the children, father and the mother, and they're not the same. They're not the same. Mothers tend to communicate with children differently from the way fathers do. We tend to make them the same, and that's not very wise. The third and final thing I'd like to talk about this morning, and we'll spend more time on this, we've talked about God's promise, we've talked about the principle of having two different testimonies to children, from the mother and from the father. The third is that everybody's different. And I'd like to spend a bit more time with this. Your children are yours and not mine. And my children are mine and not yours. People vary greatly in temperament. That is, some people are introverted, some people are extroverted. Some people are dynamic and aggressive. Some people are more passive. Some people are methodical. Some people are not naturally methodical in what they do. People differ. But God made it that way. You see, God is 3 in 1, and the human race that He made are not a series of clones, each of which is identical, but rather we're all different. We're all human, one, but each of us is different. And people vary greatly in their temperament, in their tendencies. Some people will tend to respond to things one way, some people to another. People vary greatly in their gifts. Some of us are musically gifted, some of us aren't. And we're not going to become musically gifted. We're just not going to get there. Some of us are artistically gifted, some are not. Some of us are gifted at conversation, and some are not. Some are gifted at public speaking, and some are not. Some are gifted at working with their hands, some are not. You are different from the person next to you. We're different in background. Some of us come from one type of church background, some of us come from another. And those things are more important than you think. Some of us come from the north and some come from the south. That can be more important than you think. Or from the west. Some of us come from well-to-do backgrounds where we felt a lot of security growing up. Others came from backgrounds where there wasn't much money and there was a lot of insecurity coming up. Those things will stay with you. They can be transformed, but they will stay with you. People also vary greatly in their style of life, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Now, the tendency is for us to want to insist that everybody be pretty much the same in all these things. And that's very unwise. The Bible says that these differences are not supposed to be thrown away, but they're supposed to be transfigured through the grace of resurrection. The more the church matures, the more it is able to take into itself a diversity of people. I'm not sure our church right now could handle black people in this church, especially, say, black people from North Tyler, with their different lifestyle and their different ways of doing everything. It's not to say they wouldn't be welcome here, but I'm not sure they'd fit in here. Then the question comes, should we try to make them fit in here? Or is it better for them to have their church and their ways, and for us to have our church and our ways? Is this necessarily a bad thing? No. Yet the tendency in the modern world is to try to obliterate this diversity. Now let's just take some examples. And all of these step on my toes at different places, and I'm not saying this, using these examples to single anybody out, but they are examples of things you will see where people vary, and they have a right to vary and differ. So, no poison darts, please. Spanking techniques vary from home to home. How hard I spank my child and how hard you spank yours what you spank them for, what kind of a rod you use. It's best not to evaluate too closely how other people do things like this, because they're different from you, and they're different from me. See, that's the bottom line on this. Your children will tend to be like you. My children will tend to be like me. Because of that, I understand some of the things that my child does that you might not understand. And you understand some things that your child does that I might not understand. And looking in from the outside, I might say, you know, if my child did that, I would wear him out. What is wrong with you? You're letting your child get by with murder. Well, if my child did that, maybe he needs to be worn out, because he's my child and I'm sensitive to what it means when he does that. But when your child does it, it may be a different ballgame altogether, because you are sensitive to what your child is like, where the zones of rebellion tend to be, where the things are that are not rebellion. Children do a lot of things that are destructive that are not rebellious. Children do a lot of things that are out of line, that are not deliberate. They're not acts with a high hand. They're just an excess of enthusiasm. Some children have a lot of problem with excess of enthusiasm. Some don't. All right? You will know your own children best because they're like you. They inherit more than you think. We are all brought up in the modern world where we discount inheritance. The modern view is that inheritance is all programmed into the genetic structure, which is not necessarily true. We inherit more than just genetic structure. It's all genetic structure and environment. And these things account for differences among people. Well, there's more to it than that, and it's not easy to discount it. Your children will tend to be like you. This is one of the tragedies of adoption. It's why the Bible says that the fatherless child, the orphan, is in such a tragic state, because they will be in a family with people who are not necessarily like them. So you go down to an adoption agency and you adopt a child. That child is not going to be like you, and you're not going to have that inside track of understanding why he does the things he does, or why she does the things she does. It's going to be harder. Now, the promise of the gospel is that God will overcome that difficulty. There's no reason not to adopt, but it is an extra problem. That doesn't apply to many of us here. But what does apply is that each of us are different, and our children are different. You know your kids best because they're like you. And that means at some points you have to tell people to butt out when they try to make your family over in the image of theirs. Okay? By the same token, avoid criticizing other people and their kids. Stick with biblical limitations in this area. Now, let's not say it's wrong to seek advice. In any community of people, it's wise to seek advice. Okay? Each of us come up against problems that we need advice on. But it's also true that people can kind of move in on you and try to make you deal with your children the same way they deal with theirs. Sometimes they have good advice that you ought to hear. Sometimes they don't understand the situation, and you have to tell them to, wait a minute, I know my children best. So let's go back to some examples. We talked about spanking techniques, how hard you spank your children, when you spank them, what you spank them for. Husbands and wives will differ on that, and that's not a bad thing necessarily, as we saw. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Most of our children would rather be spanked by mom than by dad. That's not necessarily a bad thing. God deals with us by degrees. We commit sin like this, God disciplines us like this. We commit big sin, God brings big discipline. It's not necessarily wrong to have that graduated in your home. Some things mom deals with, some things dad deals with. We have it in the school here. Some things teacher deals with, some things Mr. Bannock deals with. All right? It's not necessarily a bad thing if mom and dad don't spank the same way. Not necessarily bad. Can be if it's causing a lot of conflict and tension. If we don't understand the difference between mom and dad, then that can cause tension in the home. Or if one or the other is simply not holding up his or her end of the stick, that can cause problems. But it's not necessarily bad that mom tends not to spank as hard as dad. That even rhymes. How about bedtimes? My children go to bed at 8:30. If yours don't go to bed at 8:30, then you're not raising your kids right. Right? No, not necessarily right, see. Your children may be different from mine. You may have them standardized at a different time. Now, I do think, and I'll talk about this in the sermon, it's a good idea to have it standardized. Going to bed at 8 one night, 10 the next night, 9 the next night, 10:30 the next night, 8 the next night. It's not real healthy. It's not the way God dealt with his children in the wilderness. He had it all structured out for his kids. We should structure time for our kids as best we can. But your children may not have the same bedtime as mine, and that's perfectly okay. How about movies and TV? You may take your kids along to see movies that I would never take my kids along to see. Well, I may take my kids along to see a movie that you wouldn't take your kids along to see. But then your kids may have nightmares based on certain things that mine don't have. And mine might have nightmares based on certain things that yours don't have. And after all, when it comes to making a decision whether you take your kid to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's basically your decision to make. I took my kids to see Raiders of the Lost Ark. I know a father who wouldn't let his teenagers go to see Raiders of the Lost Ark because it didn't present things from a Christian point of view, which is true. It didn't. I don't think that's all there was to the movie, though. I think the children enjoyed it. They got enough out of it that did not conflict with Christianity. However, that's my decision to make. And it's your decision to make it's your right to make a different decision if you want. Television is the same. How much TV you let your kids watch. Now, I might advise you, don't let your kids watch too much TV. I would advise you. But what you let them watch, how much you let them watch, that's generally your business and not mine. And it's the people sitting next to you or in front of you in the aisle, how they do it with their kids, that's their business and not yours. And all around the room here. Okay? Now, if it spills over, you know, if your child is staying up and watching all the stuff on HBO that's shown only at night, and is coming into the school here and telling all the other kids about it, then there might be a place to have a conversation with you about a problem which has now become of concern to more families. But you have a right to make mistakes with your kids. You have a right to do things that aren't the best way to do it. I have a right to make mistakes with my kids. In fact, you and I have a right to make a lot of mistakes in life that other people should leave us alone on. We have a right to make bad deal on buying a car. We have a right to go and ask the elders, what do you think I ought to do about this? And they give you advice, and you decide not to take their advice. You have the right to do that. As long as it's in the advice category, you have a right not to take the advice of the elders. Now, if it's out of the Bible, you don't have that right. But if it's just advice, you have the right to weigh it out and say, well, all things considered, I think I'll do it my way. And you have the right to make mistakes, and you have the right to blow it, and you have the right to make serious bad mistakes. Okay? You really do. Because that's one of the ways we learn as adults. Children don't learn very well from just letting them make mistakes and learning the consequences of them. We'll talk about that. But adults do. You definitely learn from making mistakes and enduring the consequences. So you have a right to let your kids watch Sesame Street, poison their minds with that pagan filth. If that's your decision, you go ahead. That's what I was told one time. I can't get really excited about the poison in Sesame Street, but I know other people who do, and it's their decision to make. See, they can be fanatics if they want. All right, music. Much as it pains me to say, you have the right to have the AM radio on. You don't have to listen to the WRR. You may be foolish not to, but my advice is that you listen to classical music in your home. I think it provides a calmer environment, for the most part, than popular music. But you have a right not to agree with me. And who knows, maybe your children are different from mine, and maybe your decision is the right one to make. I'm not going to criticize you for it. To your face. Now, when I talk to other people around, Sure. You have the right to dump your children off with a babysitter and go to a movie with your wife. Or you have the right not to dump your kids off with a babysitter. My personal advice is it's good to leave your children with a babysitter from time to time and give your wife a break. But if you have convictions otherwise, or you don't think that your children would function well being left with a babysitter, you have a right to make that decision. And children do differ. You know, mine haven't become too terribly warped from being left with babysitters. But it's possible that your child may be different. And I'm making fun of some of these things because I think I don't want to get killed after the sermon. But I am serious when I say that children do vary, and I don't want to presume. All right. Music. Much as it pains me to say, you have the right to have the AM radio on. You don't have to listen to the WRR. You may be foolish not to, but my advice is that you listen to classical music in your home. I think it provides a calmer environment, for the most part, than popular music. But you have a right not to agree with me. And who knows, maybe your children are different from mine, and maybe your decision is the right one to make. I'm not going to criticize you for it. To your face. Now, when I talk to other people around, sure. You have the right to dump your children off with a babysitter and go to a movie with your wife. Or you have the right not to dump your kids off with a babysitter. My personal advice is it's good to leave your children with a babysitter from time to time and give your wife a break. But if you have convictions otherwise, or you don't think that your children would function well being left with a babysitter, you have a right to make that decision. And children do differ. You know, mine haven't become too terribly warped from being left with babysitters. But it's possible that your child may be different. And I'm making fun of some of these things because I think I don't want to get killed after the sermon. But I am serious when I say that children do vary, and I don't want to presume to criticize a mother who says, I don't think it's wise for me to leave my child. I want to take him with me. I don't want to be put in a position of making a criticism of that. How about the nursery and the church? You know, we've had people leave this church because we had a nursery. Not because we didn't have one, but because we did. Because they believe that no one should ever be allowed to dump their children off in the nursery. And they left here in such a way as to get themselves excommunicated in the process. Because they would not allow the elders to make decisions like that. You'd be surprised how much conflict there is in every church on earth over the nursery. Now, we have three options here. You can dump your kid off in the nursery. Ladies, you are not allowed to go in the nursery unless it's your turn. Don't go in there. I hear that ladies are congregating in the nursery again. Don't break the rule. We'll excommunicate you. That's humor. That's why Gilstrap's laughing. Okay? You have a right to do that. All right? But then, if you don't want to leave your children with someone else, which is your right and might be wise for you, you have a right to go into the overflow room and keep your child with you. Okay? And the third option you have is to keep your child with you in here, provided it's not disturbing everybody else. Okay? When your child is sound asleep in the pew and suddenly wakes up and lets everybody know it, usher them out. Okay? Until they calm down. Okay, I think we all know the dance here, the routine. It's liturgically fixed. The ritual is pat. It's instinctive. But you have these three options, all right? And who am I to say that you shouldn't keep your child in church as a baby, just because I didn't? I mean, we took full advantage of the nursery, let me tell you. And my reason for that, I'll tell you, is that I thought it was better for my wife to hear the sermon than to have to wrestle with the baby. And so we let somebody else wrestle with the baby, and she got to hear the sermon. I calculated that it would be better for our home that way. You are free to weigh it out and balance it differently. because there are different factors in your home than there are in mine. Your wife may be able to wrestle with it. Maybe you have a calm, placid baby that doesn't fight you throughout the whole service, okay? We didn't. Okay, so maybe it's no problem with your wife holding the baby and listening to the sermon. Maybe she's able to do both. Maybe the way you balance it out, given your child in your home, you think it's best to tell your wife about the sermon when you get home and let her deal with the baby in church. Maybe you just have a principle against it. You don't want to leave the baby with someone else. That's okay. You have a right to do any of those things. None of them are right. None of them are wrong. Each of us is different. Your child is different from mine. Breastfeeding. Ladies, you have a right to breastfeed or not to breastfeed. In the Bible, it was okay to use a nurse. In the Bible, the word nurse means nurse. It doesn't mean, somebody who's around the house and cleans up. It doesn't mean a hospital. It means a wet nurse. If you can use a wet nurse, you can use a bottle. Okay? You have a right to breastfeed or not to breastfeed. You have a right to circumcise or not to circumcise your child. I have my own opinion on that. You have yours. All right? Okay? I may disagree with you, but in the church here, I'll never criticize you to your face on that subject. Okay? Let's take another area where people vary. Working mothers. Some mothers can work and make it okay. Others can't. Some feel they can, some feel they can't. Some make mistakes by staying at home too much. Some make mistakes by working too much. You have a right to make mistakes in either direction. You have the right to make a decision in either direction without me or anybody else moving in and rebuking you about it. Unless it becomes a big public problem. Now, these things can become big public problems. If it's causing a lot of tension in your marriage and you come to one of us for counseling, then obviously you're seeking advice on something. Generally speaking, let's live and let live on these areas where people genuinely vary. The internal structure of homes varies somewhat. What the father does and what the mother does. Some of you men wash dishes. Some of you don't. Some of you vacuum. Some of you don't. Some of you men have never changed a diaper. I won't disgrace you by asking you to raise your hand. But some of you men have never changed a diaper. Now, personally, I think it would be good for you to change a diaper. Dirty one. It's good. Good for men. Not every day. Okay? Now, don't spoil your wife, see. If you do the dishes every day, then the next day you don't do the dishes, and it's, well, honey, do the dishes. Wait a minute, I was helping you out, now it's become my job. Okay? Some of you men take the garbage out, you have it all structured out. See? The wife, the kids set the table, they bring the dishes in, the wife does the dishes, the husband takes the garbage out, or maybe you have it structured this way. The wife does everything, and the husband sits in the living room and watches TV. Or maybe you have it structured so that on weekdays, the wife does it, and on Sunday, the husband washes the dishes. That's the way we do it. See, I give my wife a break, and I do the dishes on Sunday. So that's obviously the right way to do it. See? The internal structure of your home varies. Some of you men, your idea is the dishes have got to be done every night. You never let them sit in the sink till the next day. Well, that's your right to have your home that way, And if that's the way you've worked it out, fine. Others are willing to let the dishes pile up just a little bit. I suggest you not let them pile up too much. A disorderly home will cause disorder in other areas. Okay? People vary. It's my observation that in areas like this, people from the Midwest are more scrupulous about things like this than people from the South are. Well, people have the right to differ in these areas. Allow them the freedom to be different from you. Okay. And we could talk about homeschool or Christian school. I think at this point everybody's got their children in our school. But if we have a family move here that wants to teach their children at home, that's their right. Let them have that right. Sports. Okay? You have the right to select sports, violin, ballet, whatever you want your child to do. And you should, as parents, let me give you a rule here. We'll drop back and give a rule. Remember the things that you tend to be fairly good at, and assume that your children will tend to move along those lines. Just because everybody else's kids are playing soccer doesn't mean my kids would be any good at soccer. Okay? There's just any point in it. Just because all the other kids are taking piano or clarinet or in the band doesn't mean your child necessarily would if you just never had any musical aptitude at all and you can't see that they have any. Okay? So don't follow the crowd in this respect. You find the things that your children need to do. I think extracurricular disciplines like this are good. And making your child stick with it after it starts not being fun anymore is good. Good for the kid. Hard on you. Good for the kid. It's easier to say, oh, well, you're bored with the piano. Okay, we'll drop that. Oh, you're bored with soccer. Okay. You're bored with gymnastics. Okay, but make them stick with something. Something besides school. It's easy to stick with school. Civil magistrate will throw you in jail if your kids don't stick with school, you know. But I think some extracurricular thing is good. Okay? But don't let other people tell you what sports and whatever you want to choose. You have a right to put your children in something different from what I put my kids in. Playmates. You have the right to select your playmates. When I was a child, I played with all the kids in the neighborhood. Across the street from me, there was a family who let their kids grow up kind of wild. And this kid was kind of mean. And I suffered a certain amount from playing with this kid. I mean, there were times when he beat me up. And I wasn't any better at self-defense then than I am now. So I just got beat up. He never got hurt. But next door to them were another family, and they were nominal Episcopalians. Next door to us were Baptists. We played with all those different kids. Now, back in those days, streets were laid out straight, and you had things called neighborhoods. Now they build the streets wind around, and there aren't any neighborhoods. They try to. The winding streets are designed to isolate houses as much as possible, one from another. That's too bad. But I know Christian people will tend to think, no, I only want my kids to play with certain other kids and other kids in the church. I don't know that that's the wisest thing, but if that's your decision, that's fine. And there are kids that can be bad influences on yours. On the other hand, it's not necessarily a bad thing to let your kids play with the neighborhood kids. I don't think that's necessarily bad. So you have to know the kids in your neighborhood and the families. If you have cookouts with these people a couple of times during the summer, back in the old days when there used to be such things as neighborhoods, people did that. How many of you have cookouts with your next door neighbors and the people around about you? See? People from out of town. In Tyler, you don't do this. We're not neighborly. This is not a neighborly town. We moved into this neighborhood and nobody brought us anything. I moved into a town up north, you know, in the north where people are cold and mean. This guy brought over a 6-pack of beer. We were all unloading the truck. All of us had beards. Dan Morse was there, big beard. You know, it was winter, so it was growing real big. Everybody's beard. He comes over and says, "Are you guys Jehovah's Witnesses?" We said, "No, we're Presbyterians." Of course, he was Catholic. And he brings over a 6-pack, see? And other people in the neighborhood brought stuff over when they see you move in. Now, down here, in Tyler, they don't do it. When I grew up, people did. I remember when people moved in and out of our neighborhood, people brought stuff over to them. And we had neighborhood cookouts and things. Well, if you get to know your neighbors and your children play with them, what's wrong with that? It certainly is not my business to tell you who your children may or may not play with. I might advise you if you came and asked me and told me, you know, the kid next door has constantly got a foul mouth and a string of 4-letter words comes out of his mouth, and he watches the Playboy channel every night, I might advise you not to let your kids play with him, see? Strongly. But that's not usually the case. Most parents don't want their children growing up that way any more than you want yours growing up that way. In this conservative Baptist town, the kids next door to you probably aren't that much worse than your own. Well, that's the third principle. I've tried to talk about 3 principles that have helped me. The first is the principle of the promise, that in spite of all the mistakes we make, God will make up the deficiencies. The second is, men, relax with the fact that your wife is not going to do things the same way you do, and God made it that way, and that's really okay. It's okay for women to deal with children differently from the way men deal with them. Third, I've tried to talk about the diversity of people, that your family, you will be sensitive to things in your children that me looking in on the outside, I will misinterpret. And you will misinterpret my children sometimes and how I deal with them. But you need to kind of let me make my own mistakes, and I need to let you make yours. It will make for a better community among us if that's the case. Now, in the sermon, we'll talk about from the book of Galatians a little bit how God deals with His children. And God in the Old Testament showed Himself as the Lord, and as the Lord He controlled their lives and their environment. As the Lord He issued commands to them and told them how to live, and as the Lord He got right down there with them and spent a lot of time with them. And these are three more principles that we need to remember in how we deal with our own children. But for now, let's stand and close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we confess that the task that you have placed before us of rearing children is frightening. It's also a great privilege. It's probably one of the most awe-inspiring things you've given us to do. It's a testimony to your confidence in us that you've given us children to rear, but we have to confess that we often don't know what to do. Our instincts are misguided. We seem to be misinformed. Father, we thank you and we confess that you will make up the deficiencies that we have. We ask that you would help us all, each of us, to be better parents and to understand your will better. Bless our homes and our children, for we pray in Christ's name. Amen.